Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the University of KwaZulu-Natal Teaching and Learning TV. Teaching and Learning TV is an initiative envisioned to promote public discourse on higher education issues, and we are streaming from the 8th Annual Teaching and Learning Conference at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. We are delighted to be having conversations outside of the conference setting with many of our keynote speakers and our plenary speakers. And the aim of the session is really to further critical discussions outside of the conference, but also to provide data for researchers and opportunities for further research. It also provides the speakers with an opportunity to engage in discussions that they may not have been able to within the actual conference setting. And so this afternoon, we are delighted to speak to William Pinar, Bill. And I'm going to ask Bill to say a little bit about himself first, just by means of introduction, and then I'll introduce you to the panelists. So,
well, it's a pleasure to be here. I came from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, to teach at the University of British Columbia. My specialization is curriculum studies, an interdisciplinary field devoted to understanding curriculum. Within that field, I focus on gender studies, especially queer theory, race studies, and international studies.
Great, thank you, Bill, and you're very welcome. And then we have some distinguished scholars and guests among us, and I'd like them to introduce themselves. So, Labby, we'll begin with you.
Great. My name is Labby Ramrathan. I'm in the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and currently I'm doing two things in curriculum. One, I'm teaching a module to the honors students on teachers and curriculum and trying to make sense within their understanding of curriculum and what actually is happening and what curriculum is. And secondly, I'm also interested in and currently involved in the recurriculation of the Bachelor of Education qualification at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And really the issue around how choices are made in curriculum, what goes into the curriculum and what gets sidelined and so forth, is really intriguing to me within the context of my so-called understanding of the omnipresence of curriculum.
And is that what you'd like to talk to Bill about, a little
Perhaps.
bit about the omnipresence of curriculum?
Yes.
Okay, so we might pick up that just now. Thabo.
Hi, my name is Thabo Msibi. I teach in the School of Education and I teach postgraduate students, and the courses that I teach are largely about curriculum, in particular curriculum theorizing. I have a deep interest in queer issues, a shared sort of area of responsibility as yours. And my question really is around what is this thing that we call curriculum? Particularly as my work seeks to trouble sort of the technicist mode of curriculum, the idea that curriculum is simply a text or that perhaps it is a policy document reflective of the state's imperatives. And how do we begin to look at curriculum beyond just the sort of the textual form to speak to issues of social inequalities, identity, and how do queer the pitch of curriculum, in other words?
So very much a social justice agenda within curriculum
Absolutely.
studies. Great, thank you. And Brian.
Yes. So my name is Lester Brian, Shawa. I teach courses in higher education. I'm actually at the Department of Higher Education. One of the courses that I teach is actually curriculum design and evaluation. But I'm interested in three areas that actually you talk to in your writings. One of it is the idea of instrumental reasoning that was advanced by Horkheimer and Adorno. And how do you see that playing around within curricula? And especially if you could actually touch on curricula in South Africa, if it's possible. So the second one is the idea of that you actually advance also, and this idea of liberal education, and what opportunities do you see, from that, liberal curriculum for South Africa. The last one is the idea of the institutional autonomy, and how you actually view institutional autonomy in terms of policy frameworks and how that could be, negotiated within the university. So these are the three areas that I would want us to really talk about.
Great. So there's a whole range of issues, Paul, clearly, that has interested other scholars in your work. So I don't know where you'd like to begin. Certainly there seems to be commonalities within the liberal education, social justice, etc. And that's sort of my bias too. So maybe we could start there, the social justice imperative in curriculum, and particularly with queer theory, perhaps?
Well, in North America, the social injustice imperative began perhaps 30, 40 years ago with the women's movement and the civil rights movement and the gay liberation movement as an effort to incorporate in the K through 12 as well as university curriculum marginalized literatures, women's literatures, African American literature, and so on. So the initial moment of the social justice imperative was a matter of inclusion and acknowledgement and the recognition of varying voices. In our own time, it seems to have shifted to a somewhat, it still has that inclusionary agenda, but it's shifted, it seems, somewhat to a more aggressive sense of social amelioration. That is, that it's somehow the mission of the curriculum not only to enable students to understand the histories of social and economic inequality and other forms of prejudice and oppression, but in some way to address it in a way that ameliorates it, that changes it. And in that sense, it seems that it also incorporates the instrumentality that is, according to Horkheimer and Adorno, the legacy of the Enlightenment. That is that we can, through teaching and learning, change people sufficiently so that the social world, in fact, can change. And that is, in fact, how we should design the curriculum, to try to produce these anticipated effects. And so, historically, within the field, it's been organized around objectives, the specification of objectives, and then those objectives rendering in curriculum design, and then implementation of the design, and then the evaluation to see if the objectives have been realized. And I've been a long-time critic of this scheme, as commonsensical as it is, on many aspects, but one of them is the reduction of teaching to implementation, so that teachers' own creative freedom and their own autonomy is compromised because their own roles have been reconstrued as implementing policy makers' objectives, rather than, in fact, engaging in sometimes improvisation and various forms of not always foreseeable conduct in a classroom, depending on the events of the classroom. Certainly, gender and race are present even when people of color and of various genders aren't present in classrooms. They obviously are when they are, but those are very important for understanding historically the content of what gets taught, but also how it gets taught and to whom. And so this effort to try to understand curriculum, and especially in context, historical, social, and so on, requires us to then think about gender and race and of course nationality, especially now with the reforms being nationally based. However superficially they resemble each other worldwide now with globalization, they have a different history and a different political subtext.
Brian, does that talks a little bit to the instrumental reasoning.
It does.
And I'm wondering how that works in context.
Yeah.
But perhaps you would.
It does, and I think the notion that actually you bring this notion of the outcome, I think invokes this idea of instrumentalism, of functional kind of use of knowledge, and that I think that can be very limiting in terms of curriculum. So yeah, and I was just wondering how has this played up around in the States and in your own assessment?
Well, the cult of functionality has never been more intense, I would say, in the U.S., particularly with this rhetoric of globalization and the global marketplace and economic competitiveness and this kind of recasting of military tension as economic tension and competitiveness. It might be it's also, I think, an opportunity to affirm the value of the liberal arts, because vocationally specific and functionality-dominated curriculum is always tied to such particular economic developments or fantasies of that they're often out of date or simply irrelevant by the time graduates complete their programs. And part of the argument, even in an economistic rationality, is that the liberal arts, the humanities, the arts, especially the social sciences, enable students to understand not only the history of the present, but provide them with analytical and other kinds of skills of discernment and judgment that enable them to make more informed and wise choices that not only are in the service of their own career enhancement, but are acknowledging of their broader social and ethical obligations to others. So the liberal arts, I think, it couldn't be more timely, even though I would say the global school reform rhetoric seems to really to efface it. But now's the time to realize that knowledge isn't only functionally valuable, it's intrinsically valuable. But it's not an intrinsic value that we can necessarily specify in advance. That we have to engage in a complicated conversation with our students for them to help to identify and articulate the ways that it speaks to them or doesn't. And then informed, physically present teachers, not simply online MOOCs, can address the concerns that students themselves raise.
Well, Thabo, this is precisely what you were talking about how not to view the curriculum as simply technicist in this technical
and I mean,
way.
and especially, I mean, for scholars of curriculum or even students of curriculum, there is this pressure or this belief that once you start integrating other aspects that are outside the text or that are outside what is scripted by government, you are then diluting what students should be learning, and ultimately that the students are not learning curriculum, that they are learning something related to sociology or something else, but not purely curriculum. And I wonder, how do we resist against the pressure that often comes from colleagues or even government to say, we should be teaching what is scripted. We should be teaching what is on our policy documents. That's what the focus of curriculum is.
And perhaps to add to that, the issue of interdisciplinarity that comes in strongly. So how do you teach, I don't know, HIV without going into gender studies, without talking poverty, without, how do these issues, the intersectionality of these issues come into play?
Well, as your comment suggests, you can't.
You can't.
That interdisciplinarity and the teacher's own erudition and judgment and capacity to address the question of the moment or of the day, those are absolutely prerequisites to having an adequate representation of what the government has decreed. Because when it's only done in isolation or in strictly speaking, its own sequence, that it loses some of its contextual vibrancy, its immediacy, its relevance really to those very concrete children who are in our midst. Of course, our contractual obligation, no matter whatever the citizenship is to the guidelines the government establishes. But I would also argue that it's our professional obligation.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And in fact, our professional ethics obligate us to make these kind of interdisciplinary associations and references so that students have a much more panoramic sense of what can seem so atomized and fragmented. And
But in a sense, the omnipresence of the curriculum almost forces you not to deviate from the script.
Well,
so
not
to speak,
necessarily.
right?
It's the omnipresence really begins to open up this idea that almost everything is curriculum. Almost every way is curriculum. It's the relativity of the curriculum to the kind of courses that we want to engage in. The whole issue of interdisciplinarity, there's a particular set of things that will tell you this is what interdisciplinarity means. But you, as the teacher, facilitator, the mediator, the learning, brings in a kind of a nuanced understanding of it. You create your own curriculum in the way in which you bring out these kinds of things. So the omnipresence and the relativity of those things need to be looked at in a much more broader perspective, rather than saying this is a stated curriculum and this is what we need to make sense of. The curriculum at the interface has several interfaces, shall I say, and that makes it the kind of, the idea of the omnipresence that I think that I'm trying to push.
It's the process
It's
that
the
you were talking about
process,
earlier.
it's what we privilege, it's what we put to the margins, it's what goes as hidden, what goes as null, and so forth. All of these things comes out in the kind of relativity.
Well, that was one of the major breakthroughs of the 70s was the introduction of this concept of the hidden curriculum. That the curriculum is, of course, the official curriculum, but it's also what the students experience and the social structure of the school. The great Canadian curriculum theorist Ted Aoki introduced this distinction between the planned and the lived curriculum to try to acknowledge that, of course, the starting point and the sun of our solar system is always the official curriculum, but the enacted curriculum, how people in fact experience it, is equally important and perhaps at least as important to the students' experience of the curriculum.
And that, of course, raises the question of the role of subjectivity
Yes.
in the curriculum, right? So what place does subjectivity have? Earlier you were talking about this is my life's work. Do you want to say a little bit more about
And perhaps
that?
this is what is responding to Thabo when he says, what is this big animal called curriculum?
Yes, yes.
Well, it's about the finding and cultivation and articulation of your own voice, your own engagement with subject matter, and your own introduction of relevant material from your own experience and life and culture, and the raising of questions or even the making of disputes. I mean, all of these are really key to the educational process. And when the classroom experience is conflated with the simple implementation of objectives, then we really lose the immediacy and the excitement and the adventure of learning. And so that's why it seems to me always so essential to emphasize curriculum as a kind of complicated conversation in the sense that that we're attempting to have some elements of the excitement of a conversation, of a personal conversation in the more formal teaching.
But that sort of personal autonomy, if you like,
Yes.
has to find expression within an institutional autonomy,
right.
which is what you were raising, Brian. Do you want to say a little bit more about
I think also, your standpoint. So it's the one who mediates the curricula. So what is his or her standpoint? How do they locate themselves in terms of the understanding of curriculum? That's very, very important. And
Right.
also that plays around within the debates of institutional autonomy. And I think if we go back to people, writers like Cardinal Newman, for example, and they advocated for a curriculum that was all inclusive, a curriculum that was deep enough, and that they expressed very much in terms of the liberal arts curriculum. And I think the states in the states they have this idea that liberal arts kind of form a very serious grounding for the first years.
And in Canada as well.
In Canada, yes, and I think that's a very important aspect that we actually sometimes miss, because a liberal arts curricula that is well done can actually be a very good foundation in terms of criticality and training people.
And
all
the
the civic
tragedy is
virtues.
it tends to be limited
Yes.
to the elite private universities
Yes.
in the United States and the elite private schools.
Exactly.
So education for the masses, it's more didactic, it's more rote, it's more
Vocational.
exam-oriented,
Right.
and it's more dominated by this concern for vocation. And that's the way that economic inequality, curiously enough, covered up by a kind of rhetoric of leave no child behind, or even social justice, that
Yes.
Yeah.
that somehow for the sake of the disadvantaged and the underprivileged, that we deprive them of the education that we reserve for the children of the elite.
For the elite, yeah.
So liberal arts, in a sense, enables a more embodied curriculum.
Very much embodied, because you're working it through your own lived experience.
That's right.
It matters how you feel and what you think and how you can say it.
Yeah.
And that has everything to do with your subjective presence. And so that's a kind of prerequisite for this kind of liberal learning, as we would say.
So we've been talking a lot about the teacher, in a sense. What about the student? What does it mean to be student-centered within curriculum? discussions, discourse.
Well, that's why I prefer the definition of
Yeah.
curriculum as complicated conversation, because I think it's a false battle between teacher-centered and student-centered. I think the teacher is clearly the main interlocutor in this conversation. It's her erudition, not only of the subject matter, but of pedagogy and of developmental psychology and sociology and the philosophy of education and of gender studies. I mean, it's his capacity to thread all of that knowledge through the very singularity of his or her own speech and relationships with the students in his or her class that makes possible this kind of embodied expressivity and dialogical encounter with each other.
And I think, just as an anecdote, last week in my class, we asked the students to say, okay, you kind of advocating a learner-centered approach to teaching and learning. What do you mean by that? Simple, trying to get an understanding. And it seems a lot of the students were of the opinion that we need to put the learner at the center. But in practice, what actually that means. And this is where the issue is about. We only think about organizing the classroom in such a way that we get the students and the learners to be active and take part of their learning and so forth. But it's far beyond that. It's about how the teacher and the centrality of the teacher is still so important in the sense that who chooses what.
And when.
And when.
Sometimes learner-centered, sometimes not.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's this kind of exclusionary notion that learner-centered as opposed to teacher-centered.
Right.
When in fact there's a whole integration of all of these things. You take into consideration who the learners are. You provide the care for the learners. You understand who they are, where they come from, and so forth. That's learner-centered. The selection of the criteria of the things that you do. How do we take cognizance of who the learners are and how they are sensitive to the choices that you make? All of them become learner-centered. So that's the issue. We tend to kind of narrow our
But I
understanding.
don't want to forget how important the teacher is, because in global school reform, and the World Bank specifically emphasized teacher quality as the kind of crucible of increasing educational achievement. But it seems to be putting a teacher on the pedestal, but it turns out they're not looking up, they're looking down. They are creating this kind of demand that somehow the teacher is responsible for student learning in a way that even parents or priests aren't asked to be responsible for outcomes of their own labor. And so it's a kind of it can be a political trap to I think to endorse learner-centeredness to the exclusion, in which you're not, but to the exclusion of the absolute, but the qualified centrality of the teacher. Not as a liability, but as an opportunity.
Absolutely,
That's
but
true.
particularly in classrooms that are about social justice and about, so you're designing learning in the curriculum, but you're also designing unlearning in the curriculum. A lot of unlearning is going on with subjects that deal with advocacy. And so the role then of the teacher in that, how does she enable that unlearning to happen in the curriculum, and what is the space of that? But we've been talking about embodied curriculum, and Labby gave us an example. Perhaps others can embody the curriculum a little bit for us. Tell us a few more of your narrative stories engaging with curriculum. What does that mean?
We can talk another thing about the kind of, the whole idea of a flexible curriculum for undergraduates. And what does that mean? I mean, we've looked at it in terms of the structure of undergraduate degree. We've had over 100 years of the same kinds of structure. What does it mean to have a bachelor's degree? What does it mean to have 2 majors in a bachelor's? What is that suggesting?
What does
How-
it suggest?
All right, these are socially constructed, historically specific forms, but that doesn't render them irrelevant or outdated necessarily. I mean, in the Catholic Church, we still have Mass. I mean, there are some rituals that we cling to because they still have meaning, not because necessarily they're functional. This kind of questioning in the States is led by the corporations who want to reduce the number of years, by government who doesn't want to take on the student debt problem. And so it has a political subtext. I'm not sure what that might be in South Africa, but it has a definite a political subtext in the States.
I think over here it's slightly different in that there is almost this belief that we are now producing students that are unemployable, and this notion that we now need to extend.
Where's the data for that?
And so,
Who's providing that data?
Where's the data? Is that what you said?
Where's the data?
If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist.
Because in the Council of Higher Education report, which I review tomorrow for the keynote, there are many assertions like this, but without data, which I find extremely curious.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, but it is a political project still. I mean,
Right.
the fact that there is no data
Right.
speaks to the political.
reveals it's-
absolutely.
right.
Yeah.
But perhaps coming back to this idea of the two majors and why is it important? What kind of disciplinary knowledge, and not in the Foucauldian sense like you said earlier, but what kind of disciplinary knowledge is needed? I mean, surely that's the thinking behind that. And then how does that function in a world where, I mean, in your field, which you are interested in, gender studies, and I'm interested in Thabo, and others are interested in, how does that work in an interdisciplinary way? If you say you have to major in these disciplines, how does that get expressed in a major, in the curriculum?
It's an issue that I also raised a bit earlier. It's our kind of interplay between the form and process.
Right.
And we kind of begin to say, what drives the other? And it seems like, the content is driving the curriculum rather than the form. And the kind of interplay between the content and the form. In other words, the process of learning. What is it that we want to, what agenda we are trying to push through a particular form or structure or substance? And it goes to talking about the emphasis that we need to play and put in terms of developing this graduate. Because when I look back at my own BSc degree, which I've done possibly 20 odd years ago, what have I learned from that? Have I learned the content, the process? And for
Both,
me,
I suspect.
and it's through the content that we learn the process. And so how those things are now engineered in further curriculum design and development. So does it mean we have to do it twice to demonstrate that in a bachelor's degree by doing two majors?
Okay. So is the process as important as the product? The outcomes, the objectives, right? Because that's what, on those evaluation forms, that's what appears, right? What have the outcomes been met? Have the outcomes of the curriculum been met? Thabo.
But there is great danger in crafting, as Bill has already said, crafting curricula around outcomes, and because ultimately you end up being driven by this agenda of getting to that X that is located there without actually understanding the complexities that lie, in the middle of this. And ultimately what we need to be asking is, how do we produce citizens, and I'm using citizens in a very qualified way, that can think independently on their own, that can contribute towards their own sort of self-emancipation? Because there is, for me, a concern again that we, by centralizing the teacher so much often, that the student voice at times gets lost, and we end up thinking that it is only the teacher that has this knowledge, and it is only the teacher that can drive this agenda. But in fact, often when one is teaching, one is often also led by what the students bring in, the knowledge that they bring into the classroom. And I think that also is not taken into account.
It's true, but I must say, if I took your course and you put me in a small group and I never got to hear you speak, I'd be most disappointed.
No, absolutely.
So I think it depends on the teacher. Whether what you're saying is interesting and models a kind of independence of thought.
Agreed.
Simply the behavior, I think, doesn't guarantee. And if you don't mind me devil's advocating the second point, I don't think we can produce this or that. I think what we offer is we offer opportunities.
Sure.
Yes.
And it's the obligation of students to take advantage of them.
Sure.
To the extent that it's demanded that we produce the results, we're no longer involved in an educational process, but a socialization, even a kind of militaristic indoctrination process, really.
No, I agree. I completely agree. And it's not. I use produce perhaps in a very qualified way because
was one of my red flags.
I do not have this idea
One
of,
of
you
my
know,
red
creating
flag
robots
words,
at the end of
yeah.
the day that must, no, absolutely.
But,
Sometimes the nomenclature sometimes can be very misleading. Nomenclature that we use to
Yes,
label our
yes,
degrees.
yes.
I mean, other countries, I think that what they've done is actually they don't even qualify the PhD. So you can have a PhD, you can study engineering, or somebody studies medicine, somebody studies education. You all have a PhD. They just don't even qualify it. And I think it's all these debates on nomenclature and the labels that you want to choose. So really, I mean, certainly I know in some universities in New Zealand, all of you, if you have done a PhD, you have done a PhD. So they don't want necessarily to have the labels, PhD in engineering or PhD, because those things also invoke some, labels, that sometimes may be simplistic.
So I think of these kind of concerns about the duration and graduation rates and behavior. I see them as a form of what I call organizationalism. That is that we focus on the institution of education and imagine then that in the black box that somehow it produces certain effects. For me, it's the quality, intellectual quality and discernment and sensitivity of what it's the quality of the curriculum for me. That's crucial, and that's partly the guidelines and the materials that we have at our that are available, but it also depends on our own teaching, of course. But it also depends on students' willingness to be students and not customers.
well, if we put it like that, then what role, and given Thabo, what you're saying, and I think I agree to a large extent, but then what role does the design of the curriculum play? How do you design a curriculum that enables the process rather than just focusing on the product, right? So how would you design a curriculum like that practically, and what would it look like? And in the light of the institutional imperatives, because we have to live with that, right?
For me, that's a technical question. If you want its answer to be universalized or generalized, for me, I would ask maybe I would ask you how you might design a curriculum, but it has to incorporate, I think, our own. Dare I use the word distinctiveness? As a teacher, as a scholar, and our sensitivity to our own students and what could be more accessible and interesting for them, and we would be constantly changing, I would think.
Can I just say, I mean, there is a major concern in relation to sort of even, and I'm in full agreement, in relation to sort of this distinctiveness in our context, where there was
context and in our disciplines,
and in our
right?
disciplines,
What we
I mean,
teach,
we went through a transition in 1994, and overnight, individuals were now expected to be transformed beings, having transformed classrooms and teach in transformed ways. But there was never ever a question as to what does it envisage? I mean, how do you become a transformed agent, having had a history that you've had? How do you, produce an emancipatory, an emancipatory space? Those questions were never quite asked in this country. It was just expected that, the curriculum will sort everything out. Boom. This is what we expect you to do. Go ahead with it. And I think that's a key challenge for curriculum scholars.
It was a terrible setup. For disappointment.
Seriously, I think academics ought to be very prepared to be able to do that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
If academics are not prepared, then the curriculum is not going to be mediated in the way you would want to achieve, especially if you want to achieve emancipatory, issues. Then you really need to have people who actually understand what they're doing in class. So.
Well, clearly, I mean, all these discussions are centering around also the issue of curriculum reform. Bill, you've written extensively on this, right? You would say a little bit more about that?
Well, I've studied the reform in several countries, including this one. So it's each one of them has different histories and trajectories and controversies. So it's except the only general conclusion I would make is they all fail. They're never brought off. The scapegoat. The scapegoats tend to change in the various countries, but teachers are prime suspect, of course.
Right.
Never the government, never the funding, never the preparation. Education professors come in, I think, a close second. But I, for my own, and I know I'm being jocular here, but not entirely, that in many cases, in the United States certainly, and I must say I am privileged to work in a country where there is no school reform. I'm so proud of Canada for passing on this. But in the United States, the reform was never meant to succeed. It was a rhetorical gesture. It was scapegoating teachers for the sake of elections. And probably the Kennedy reform in the 1960s had sincerity, but nonsense. So I'm rather cynical about the situation in the States, but I'm, as you maybe heard today, I'm rather taken with the Chinese. The scale of their aspiration, however impossible the circumstances, I think it deserves our applause and appreciation and study. They really are attempting to do a cultural, subjective reconstruction of themselves as people within the structures that are inviolate, political structures and economic structures, populational structures. And so it's a remarkable undertaking the reformers have, and their ethical conviction is what comes through for me. It's not about making money, well, for some, but in general, it's a matter of ethics rather than gain. So, so it depends nationally. And here, I think, well, I don't need to talk about the reform in South Africa, but it certainly was a lost opportunity, even though it was earnest and well-intended. But,
Well, I think on that reformed
All
note, we can end this rather stimulating
Well, thank you very
conversation and
much.
very inspiring. Thank you to all our guests, and thank you, Bill,
Thank you.
for chatting
Thank
with
you.
us. Great. Thank you.